Indulge me for a moment, because a couple things I'd like to point out before we actually start the slideshow. One is this. It says I've been vaccinated. I hope you have. If you haven't, I hope you take every opportunity to be vaccinated. Felt nothing, no side effects, both vaccinations, and I'm elated that it's happened. Now, here's another thing, and this is something I do from time to time. Where are we here? Some of you might recognize it. Some of you have been there. I have a couple of times. It's a wonderful museum. It's called the National Maritime Museum. It happens to be the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, England. I prefer a National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, England. Of course, there are maritime museums all over the world. Peru has a wonderful one, so does Spain, Italy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we were found by ships. Columbus and his crew with the Galea, which we call Santa Maria, with the Santa Clara, which we call Nina, and with the brightly painted one, which we call Pinta, and then the Mayflower, et cetera, et cetera. So shouldn't America have a National Maritime Museum? I've always thought we should. Where should it be? I've always thought Newport News. I'm a little biased. Guess what? We have one. That's it. We didn't just name it that. Congress named it that in 1994. The Mariners Museum and a museum in New York that has been closed, South Street Seaport, are the National Maritime Museum. So we're the last man standing. We are America's National Maritime Museum. Just gives you something else to brag about, Newport News. We also built the United States. Anyway, now let's do this. 1787. A new constitution for a new nation. The operator's manual for a confederation of a sovereign people with self-governing authority by means of revolution or contract, the grace of God, an independent nation of free citizens who recognize no king, no dictator, no emperor. With the conclusion of the American Revolution and the Treaty of Paris in 1783, we thought the job was done. There were dark clouds on the horizon, and they portended a new struggle for the heart and soul of an established empire and a young fledgling democracy. The job was not done. We had just begun. 25 years after the treaty was signed that brought to a close the American Revolution, our infant nation found itself insulted, challenged, attacked, and blockaded by the very forces that had been defeated just 25 years ago. 25 years. How would a new generation see this affront? What would be their national response? Today, after over 2 centuries, we'll revisit the War of 1812, one of the most complex and controversial wars in our history, a war that saw of our country the highest of highs, the lowest of lows, elation and despair, joy of victory, and the ultimate insult of defeat. It was a confusing and messy war, but isn't that true of almost all wars? The War of 1812 is worth commemorating, even if you believe, as many did, that it was inconclusive. It was unnecessary. In the next hour or so, we'll follow the course of events preceding the war and learn why the outcome set precedents for the many decades that followed and defined boundaries that exist today. In fact, led to the establishments of national territories that would stand for centuries. What were the causes? Did it have to happen? What were America's options? You will be challenged to come up with and defend a response that would satisfy the challenging circumstances of the time. It's very difficult to begin at the beginning when the beginning is so vague, so disjoint, so contradictory. Yes, America had adopted a constitution, but one that did not establish any sort of foreign policy. And foreign policy was certainly a pivotal issue that would have to be decided as events unfolded. A history in training. There were no guidelines. There was no precedent. Well, the Americans would have to carefully balance their relationships with the European nations, particularly Great Britain and France. Sticky? You bet. Who had America sided with in the French and Indian War? Why, the mother country, of course, the British. But then who had strongly and materially supported America in their Revolution of Independence? That's the Marquis de Lafayette. It was the French who supported us. Who is our ally now in 1812? Should America establish permanent alliances to further confuse the foreign policy issue? America was yet a divided nation. They were not united. New England, among the first and most powerful of the colonies, knew that war would be harmful to their interests. Their strength in Congress was waning, and every new state admitted made the slices of the pie that much smaller. These hardy and independent folk were experiencing a regular and proportionate decrease in their national power. And communications were, as we shall see, poor at best and generally non-existent for the most part. Most of the country could not communicate with each other. No telegraph. Pony Express is still a half century away. Printing presses are just now becoming modernized with steam. Great Britain, they're still using semaphore towers, which were not much of an improvement over the fire signals of yesteryear. This is a medieval concept. Vast regions of the country were essentially cut off from any news that might have affected them, nor did they care a great deal about national events. Daily survival, that was their key issue. They had their farms and their businesses. They were satisfied that a peaceful and progressive existence was possible without constant and instant news of the world. Well, the War of 1812 is therefore sometimes referred to as the War of Poor Communication. So an immediate national consensus was just not possible. Events of the time unfolded over periods of months and years, not hours, days, weeks. All sorts of changes could take place in the space of time between the firing of a cannon and the response to an act of belligerence and aggression. The bridge at Concord, the shot heard around the world. But the new country did, in their blissful ignorance, think that our differences with England had been resolved, should be left behind. And with good reason, even though tensions remain between the mother country and her young offspring. Well, here's what the new US had agreed to in Paris. And the treaty was quite generous in its terms. Article 1, the US is now free, sovereign, and independent, and the British Crown relinquishes all claims and rights to its former colonies. Article 2, clear boundaries between British North America and the US were drawn. British North America is Canada. Number 3, this is quite important. Fishing rights were broadly granted, notably St. Lawrence Gulf and the very productive Grand Banks. Number 4, lawful contracted debts would be honored on both sides. Number 5, provisions were made to restore confiscated lands to rightful owners. And number 6, confiscation was hereby and forthwith prevented and prohibited. Number 7, prisoners of war would be immediately released. Article 8, Great Britain and the US would continue to have access to the mighty Mississippi River in perpetuity. Number 9, territory captured by the United States subsequent to the treaty would be returned gratis. And number 10, and this paid attention to communication at the time, ratification was to be complete within 6 months of signing. How much damage can be done in 6 months? It really was not a bad deal on either side, partly because you see the names attached to it. One of those is John Adams, one is John Jay, and one is Dr. Benjamin Franklin. Well, we're going to take an objective look at the causes and the effects from both the British and the American side and see if we can find an answer as to why this treaty did not last. Great Britain was at war. I don't know if this is a real word, but works for me, and it worked for Britain at the time. Status bellicosis. Don't look it up. I just made that up. It's a state of rather continuous war. War with the French, war with the Dutch, war with Spain, even war with themselves from time to time. But right now, from about 1803, their chief irritant was this guy. That's just a clue. I didn't show you his face, and you know who he is. Now, America, weak in the military department and therefore not able to properly protect and convoy trade ships, still aspired to trade with every reachable country. Pick a country, any country. Great Britain was at the time, had been recently, or will be soon at war with that country. So herein lies a proximate cause, or perhaps several. British sailors are deserting and running off to join the Americans. In fact, in the 18th century, desertion rates in the British Navy averaged 25%. 1 man in 4 in a British ship deserted. Needs for ordinary naval seamen would jump by 20 to 40,000 men in wartime. And the limited number available were being sought not only by His Majesty's Royal Navy, but also by the privateers and by the merchant navy. Recruiting these numbers by ordinary means was simply not a workable option. So the Impress service was formed. They were formed to force sailors to serve on the ships of the Royal Navy. There was no such thing as joining the Navy at the time. A sailor joined a ship and was expected to serve in that ship for the duration of its commission. The sailors soon learned, however, that pay was poor. In fact, it was delayed by months, even years, if it was ever received at all. Sailors' pay was set in 1653 by scale and did not change and increase until April 1797, following the mutiny at Spithead. Sailors on 80 ships of His Majesty's Royal Navy in the Channel Fleet, a blockade fleet, which was quartered and based at Spithead, quietly left their ships and approached the Admiralty with letters of demand for better provisions, more humane treatment, and higher wages. Well, after some discussion, and not a little coercion, they were recognized and the requests were met, sort of. Pay scale was increased, but it was still paltry and did not meet the pay on the East Indiaman. The sailor's best hope, therefore, was either to join a merchant ship where pay was better and more reliable, or to turn coats and join an American ship where pay was better and more reliable, or to capture an enemy ship without destroying it. The ship would then be sold into the Royal Navy, and prize money, sometimes substantial amounts, would be distributed proportionally among the crew or crews responsible for the capture. Sometimes the number of crews sharing the money would grow enormously as ships in the vicinity of the capture would claim a share legitimately. This is an interesting cartoon that I really like. Political cartoons of the time were works of art. Why starboard sailor, the starboard watch? How is this at prayers when the enemy is bearing down upon us? Are you afraid of him? The sailor says, afraid? No. I was only praying that the enemy's shot may be distributed in the same proportion as the prize money, the greatest part among the officers. So you get the biggest prize, you suffer the most damage. A deserter who had received neither his pay nor his prize money gave that up by desertion. This may certainly have provided some incentive to serve out his time in the hopes of reimbursement and reward at some distant and uncertain time in the future. So the impress service was formed to force men to join a ship, sometimes in the most nefarious ways. Often, American merchant ships were stopped at sea, and any crew aboard who had an earring or queue, a pigtail, rough hands, or even spoke in the language of a common jack tar, was subject to seizure and movement into the British ship. This was considered fair and okay with the Navy and those who wrote the rules. Incidentally, gentlemen and confirmed apprentices were exempted, as were those too old or too young or too infirm to serve. It's hard to find accurate numbers, but estimates of impressed American seamen range from about 4,000 to well over 10,000 during the few years preceding 1812. Consider the British position. We could talk about this all day. They needed men. They had rights to at least get the men of British heritage off American ships and into British ships. Well, yeah. Consider also the times and the nature of warfare. In a few short years after the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, wars would be fought from the sea as opposed to at sea. This, of course, is Admiral Lord Nelson. Would that change the manpower needs? Would it change the skills required to wage war successfully? Is our nuclear navy trained differently from the navies of the 19th century? Well, now consider the American position. Here lies a new country desperately trying to hold the two ends of very short ropes together. America had to defend their territory, the very large portion of which bordered the North Atlantic. So the solution, ships. The solution is always ships. Ships need sailors. Every time the American Navy or merchant fleet filled a ship with competent sailors and sent it to sea, the King's Navy stopped the ship and stole the men. One of the most notorious and pivotal events that underscored the arrogance of the Royal Navy's impressment operations occurred in the early summer of 1807, and it occurred right out here in the Chesapeake Bay. A British frigate, HMS His Majesty's ship Bellicosis, lost 3 men through desertion. They had actually commandeered the captain's launch, which is a boat that's carried on the ship, and rowed to Norfolk, Virginia, where they signed aboard the 38-gun frigate Chesapeake, a U.S. ship. Now, these men, Daniel Martin, John Strahan, and William Ware, were American citizens who had signed aboard American ship, were wrongly impressed into the HMS Bellicosis. Well, the commander of the Royal Navy in Canada, Admiral George, this is the Chesapeake, incidentally. The commander of the Royal Navy in Canada, Admiral George Berkeley, had ordered a search of all American shipping. Well, the 3 were found, of course, and Britain ordered the return of the deserters. James Madison, Secretary of State, with President Thomas Jefferson's permission, simply refused to obey the order. Admiral Berkeley is perturbed, to put it mildly. He ordered all Royal Navy ships to stop and search the Chesapeake wherever she was encountered. As fate would have it, a few days later, the Chesapeake, sailing out of Hampton Roads Harbor, set a course that would take her right into the path of His Majesty's ship Leopard, a 4th-rate ship of 56 guns. The rating system, incidentally, just very briefly, actually lined up ships so that the wars, the battles at sea, would be fair. A first-rate ship had 90 to 100 guns, picture the Victory. A second-rate ship still had 3 gun decks each and had about 80 guns. A third-rate ship almost always had 74 guns on 2 decks. A fourth-rate ship had 50 to 60 guns. The Leopard, of course, was a fourth-rate ship of 56 guns. On June 22nd, they met. Captain Salisbury Humphreys in the Leopard ordered Chesapeake to heave to and be boarded. Commodore James Barron of the Chesapeake said into his speaking trumpet, "I can't hear you." The Leopard fired a shot across Chesapeake's bow. The Chesapeake, totally unprepared for a sea battle, did nothing. Her gun ports were closed. Her cannon were unloaded. Her decks were not cleared for action. She took several broadsides without response, sustaining massive damage, losing 3 sailors, 18 wounded, including Commodore Barron. The British boarded the crippled frigate, took the 3 deserters, and an Englishman they happened to find, John Wilson, who incidentally was hanged when the Leopard went back to her home port in Halifax, and they took her prize home. Well, later the Chesapeake was allowed to repair herself and limped back into Hampton Roads. You can imagine the national sentiment when she returned to port, offloaded her dead and wounded, and recounted the event to the local press. Outrage would be about right. Sailors and citizens took up the shout, "Remember the Chesapeake," as their battle cry and their motivator. Incidentally, if you study the War of 1812, you will certainly come across the Chesapeake again, and that's the deal with the Shannon, the Battle of Boston Harbor on June the 1st, 1813, exactly 1 year after an item we'll name soon. Just didn't want you to think I'd forgotten about the Chesapeake and Shannon. Famous battle. Well, Britain ultimately disavowed the actions of Captain Humphreys, pardoned the 3 Americans, made some token restitution, and attempted to put the Chesapeake affair behind them, but did not change their policy of impressment. Remember, they had promised in 1783 not to interfere with America's commerce, that American citizens would be free, sovereign, and independent. These American men had signed on to American ships of their own accord. That's not going to be easily solved. Both sides had good, strong arguments for their actions, their responses. So impressment was most certainly a pivotal issue in the years preceding 1812. Notice it has a number, 1. Stay tuned. What was another issue that stirred America to action? Something we almost take for granted. How about trade? Now, America had elected a president early on, had elected, what was that guy? George Washington had elected a president. George Washington established a form of government and secured and identified boundaries, checked all the squares. Incidentally, Washington had issued a Neutrality Proclamation in 1793, which became the Neutrality Act, passing through Congress, of 1794, declaring the U.S. neutral in the French war with pretty much the rest of the world. Remember, they had a leader who aspired to be emperor of the world. You got to fight them all if you're going to be their emperor. This will be important. What else did the young country need? Would it be a good idea to have some money in the bank? Taxes. How do you raise money if you're a government? Taxes. Yes, they were enacted, particularly a liquor tax. Public subscription. Somewhat controversial. These can lead to a plutocracy, as we've found. Well, these were the means of raising capital. There was another. The truest and best path to raising funds was to sell something you have. That could be goods, could be services, It could be debt, sale of bonds. America, as we noted earlier, was keen to trade with any willing buyer. So securing trade agreements and providing safety for trade became the central issue of foreign policy. But England was at war with, let's say, France for now. Incidentally, these are the trade routes, but note the areas that the trade flows to and through. England was at war with France right now. Any trade, therefore, would have to circumvent essential blockades enforced by Britain. And the American merchants attempted to do so by claiming their neutrality. How dare the United States trade with an enemy of Great Britain? What kind of neutrality does that show? Recall the Neutrality Act, 1793, 1794. Again, the Constitution was silent on this point. The U.S. had made a decision, right or wrong, to stay out of this conflict. They couldn't really trade with warring nations, could they? So England made their move to hinder trade, to restrict access to sea lanes, blockade ports of embarkation, and otherwise confound and essentially cut off America's trade with their orders in council, which said essentially just those things. Orders in council signed in 1807 would have brought all those to bear. England, by 1794, had seized over 300 American ships engaged in trade in the French West Indies. Did you figure that out from the first map? Held by France at the time. Now, don't misunderstand. England welcomed trade with her former colonies as long as it was profitable to England. But now it threatened her own economy and her ability to control French commerce. Remember, Great Britain had a powerful navy that after many years of war at sea had become virtually invincible. Experience in war is one of the best teachers, perhaps the best teacher, but the cost is dear in terms of what? Material, ammunition, ships, money, men. So the Royal Navy also stepped up their impressment of sailors from those ships taken or detained. Now the fledgling government of the new U.S. had little choice but to throw up their hands. In national anger, or as an act of defiance, in 1807, President Thomas Jefferson signed the Embargo Act, which stopped virtually all trade. Virtually all trade. The intent was, of course, to punish France and Great Britain by denying them American agricultural goods and manufactured products. Bad move. Seemed like a good idea at the time. President Jefferson should have thought through this a little bit more thoroughly, a little more deeply, and a little beyond consequences. Well, as we know today, Jefferson was sort of a peacenik. He was an astute, very intelligent man, well-read, a Renaissance man of his time. He felt naively that men could debate issues of national import and come to a logical agreement. Let's say a compromise. Words you don't hear too much in today's halls of Congress. He also had an intense dislike and distrust of Britain and felt that such a monarchy was decidedly a hindrance to a free people and an independent governance, and a major precipitant to war. His agenda had to do with establishing ties through trade, and that trade would bind the countries of the world in harmony and cooperation. Well, he was wrong. Thus, embargo. Britain and France were not really hurt by this embargo decision. Their economies were established, and relatively speaking, they were thriving. No, his embargo hurt the United States much more than it hurt its intended targets. American commerce was deprived of its chief markets. Thousands upon thousands were put out of work. Public outcry was strong. Public outcry was loud and deep. And consider this. A complete embargo was the second most severe step that could be taken to right these alleged wrongs. The only option left was all-out war. Mr. Jefferson left himself and his legislature no wiggle room. Well, they're trying to get things right. They're just, for a number of reasons, not doing a very good job of it. America's on the road to war, all right, or something like it. What else might have been the last straw? Think about this. When the first colonists arrived, were they alone? Of course not. They had company. And how did they treat the original residents? There was very, very little of this friendly handshake, let's do lunch, before the action began. We're moving in, get out of the way. So there was conflict, treaties, land grabs, skirmishes, massacres. This was a pretty rough period in our history. The Battle of Tippecanoe, fought in November 1811, is considered a significant event in this period of Indian uprisings and battles, and a strong supporting cause for the War of 1812. William Henry Harrison, later president, governor of the Indiana Territory, directed a militia of some 1,000 regulars and volunteers toward the village of Prophetstown, Indiana. Located on the Tippecanoe River, this was a suspected base of Indian operations. Their intent was to destroy the village and therefore scatter and weaken the burgeoning and strengthening alliance of tribes. A delegation of natives met Harrison's militia and suggested a peace pipe. Sit down and talk, a parley. Harrison agreed, and so camped his troops some distance away. During the night, the Indians attacked Harrison's camp and killed nearly 200 soldiers. Harrison's superior forces regrouped and eventually defeated the Indians, forcing them to disperse and then burning their village to the ground. How does this become a cause of conflict with Great Britain? The Brits have an interest here. Northern territories are still under the British flag, and this is where much of the settlers versus Indians action is occurring. The British wisely side with the Indians, including an alliance with the charismatic Indian leader Tecumseh, a Shawnee, and leader with his brother Tenskwatawa of a large tribal confederacy. Tenskwatawa translates to the prophet. The Confederacy was the pan-Indian movement. Britain was blamed for supplying weapons to the Native Americans at Tippecanoe. Now, is this wrong? Here in lands that may be of value to either side, the Nuevo Americans are suppressing the Native Americans and taking their land. Okay, the British slip in and supply arms, rally Indian nations, provide support to the Indians in the Midwestern territories. Hey, they're supporting the freedom fighters. And there may be an element of I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine in this decision. What would you do? Okay, what would you do if there was oil under that disputed land? Right. Remember, the Great Britain was already at war, not in America, in Europe. I don't think the Crown saw this Indian stuff as an act of war. Their war efforts were already deployed elsewhere. It was a minor act of support for the Native Americans and a defense of potentially valuable land in North America. So America was not happy with British support of the various uprisings that occurred with alarming frequency during the 18th and 19th centuries. Well, that's three strikes so far. What else was in the minds of the new American public? Remember the words to a song that we all know, From Sea to Shining Sea? There's a philosophy that embodies that thought. You learned about it in history. What's it called? Most of you got that right. Manifest destiny. This phrase hasn't been coined yet here in the early 1800s, but the concept is in the hearts and minds of all those who moved west from the first settlements along the Atlantic coast. Moved west. Whether or not it was embodied in any constitutional form, or enacted as the law of land, or practiced as something normal, expansion was going to be our mission until America's boundary reached the Pacific coast, Hollywood. Throughout the West, there was a strong conviction that the frontier lands would not be secure until the British were expelled from Canada and the entire region became a part of the United States. Well, while westward expansion may not rank among the highest of priorities over which to butt heads with England, it certainly fanned the flames of rebellion. And Mr. Jefferson in 1803 had gained a huge plot for the United States. He sent James Monroe, his Secretary of State, to France to make a purchase. Napoleon Bonaparte, having grown tired of his attempts at imperialism in the New World and very much concerned about news of the uprising and rebellion of the black slaves in Haiti, offered the Louisiana Territory for $15 million. The greatest real estate transaction in our history. Monroe, without time to wait for President Jefferson's approval, accepted the offer, and John Quincy Adams, in 1811, wrote to his father thus: "The whole continent of North America appears to be destined by divine providence to be peopled by one nation, speaking one language, professing one general system of religious and political principles, and accustomed to one general tenor of social usages and customs for the common happiness of them all, for their peace and prosperity. I believe it is indispensable that they should be associated in one federal union." He didn't say the whole of these United States, did he? He said the whole continent of North America. Great Britain did not want the U.S. to expand west. This threatened their own interests in Canada. In fact, the British military had not abandoned forts in the Northwest as they had agreed to do under the treaty, and at a time in a sub-treaty after the treaty. Look at the forts. There are 2 active forts here. There are 5 here. There are another 3 here. They had active forts all over the place and up into the east. But westward ho was America's cry, and west they went. Those Native Americans we spoke of earlier, they did not like the methods by which these Conestogans expanded, did they? There are about 7 million Americans spread across 18 states, and that number was growing rapidly and growing by leaps and bounds. Expansion was not just a preference, not just an option. It was a point of survival. Americans are farmers. Farmers want land, good, fertile land. Now, how did these 4 issues combine to bring America underpeopled, underarmed, unconvinced of its necessity, unsure of any kind of favorable outcome, underfinanced, and without benefit of accepted guidelines on foreign policy? How did they bring America to the brink of war with Great Britain in 1812? And further, what did the British think would happen? The British remember 1812 as the year Napoleon marched on Moscow. Is this surprising? From their perspective, America's challenge was an annoyance and a distraction. Who's that? When I said 1812, I remembered Pete Tchaikovsky. He wrote a song about it. Well, it was an annoyance, a distraction. It was a sideshow from a monarchy at war with the most notorious imperialist in the world. James Madison was an irrelevant irritant. As a consequence, Great Britain would have to meet the challenge with what could be spared of their finances, their armies, their navies, their manpower. They could not redirect more than 5, 6, 7% max of the resources to this very ill-timed challenge. In their view, a war with America would be the result of a war with Napoleon. The British issued orders in council. One of the major points of disagreement were enacted because American merchants were trying to exploit their neutral status to run through necessary British blockades. Manpower needs to fight the Napoleonic War necessitated stepping up. There it is again. Impressment. Even America's leaders admitted in private that as much as 50% of sailors in American merchant ships were indeed British citizens. We say subjects in Britain now. Now, many British statesmen were of the opinion that the orders in the council could be lessened, and they were in fact fully suspended in the summer of 1812, but no one challenged Britain's right to impress her sailors, to retrieve them from foreign ships to which they had deserted. These American ships, merchant and navy, enlisted seamen from Britain in full knowledge that Britain had great need of them to continue their war with France. Add to this America's persistent history of restrictions and complaints to the Crown over a decade, evidencing Jefferson's and Madison's pro-French mindset. And you'll find very few Great Britain sympathetic to America's cause when the conflict arose in 1812. Furthermore, many had recent and vivid memories of the American Revolution. Some had lost sons, brothers, and fathers in the battle. And so the British had no interest in another war. Not now. But in their national arrogance, they had no appetite for compromise either. And defending the territories in North America was of utmost importance. So was Great Britain hungry to let loose the dogs of war? It didn't matter now. The orders in council had been lifted, but there was no means of timely communication of the act. There was, therefore, little cause for war with America. But in June of 1812, it was too little, too late. War was imminent. It could not be stopped. Okay, here's where you come in. What sort of war? When? You may place yourself, with my permission, virtually in a position of authority. Weigh for yourselves America's options, as Congress did in response to James Madison's message, June 1st, 1812. After enumerating the various injuries and injustices America had suffered and declaring America in kind had continued in a state of peace. I'm not getting forwards here.
Ron, at present moment, people are voting, and so far at between about 50%, we have defending rights and honors through limited maritime war and delayed armed conflict until prepared.
Okay. Now, can we take that off so I can get the other slides?
Yes, I'm gonna give it one more minute or so and let everybody continue. We're about at 60%.
Now, you
for
can
number two.
continue to think about your votes also, because there'll be more information here.
All right, a few more seconds and we'll end that. All right, and we're going to stop polling now, and we've got 67% on option number 2, 33 on the third one.
Okay, give me those figures again when I get to the bottom of this so we can discuss it. Not now, but after we've gone through this.
Okay.
Thank you. Well, I'm not moving slides. We're going to be a couple slides back. I'm going to go ahead. We'll be a couple slides back. As soon as we can, I'd like to move slides, Wisteria. Whether the James Madison's message on June 1st, 1812, after enumerating all these alleged injuries, etc., and America had continued in a state of peace regardless of all that, President Madison wrote this: whether the United States shall continue passive under these progressive usurpations and accumulated wrongs, or opposing force to force in their defense of their national rights, is a solemn question which the Constitution wisely confides to the legislative department of the government. And that's you guys. You are the Congress now. I should have thought of that. Okay, there's James Madison. The years leading up to 1812 showed both the problems and the dreams of a new nation. The desire to prosper, to grow, to be taken seriously by the great powers of Europe were clearly manifest in the words and actions of America's leaders. Madison was well aware of the country's divided opinions on the subject of war. He wisely left it to the people's representatives in Congress. The ensuing debate would be of critical importance to the nation's future, and given Madison's and the Democratic Republican Party's views on America's future, would decide fundamental issues of war and peace, not just for the United States, not just for England, but for the world. The chosen course of action might forever define America as either a weak and passive nation or one focused on independence, on democracy and unity. So you've had the opportunity to weigh the four principal options. I don't know whether you can change your votes or not, but you don't need to, that emerge from the congressional debate, and decide which might best serve the ends that you see as important. You are the virtual authority. You are the Congress of the United States of America. Each choice is based on a particular set of values and beliefs. Some are self-explanatory. There were obviously the hawks of war, led by Henry Clay, Speaker of the House, John Calhoun, Congressman from North Carolina, Andrew Jackson, and others. There were those who favored a limited and more cautious approach, such as John Jacob Astor, a merchant that we all know, Stephen Decatur, U.S. Navy Commodore, and James Monroe, the Secretary of State. Those who felt that war was the answer, but America was not yet ready and needed some time to prepare, included Obadiah German, senator from New York, Thomas Salmons, a congressman from New York, James Bayard, senator, Manuel Ayer, who in a letter to his congressman, and Mr. Ayer was an active reactionary, in a letter to his congressman, Joshua Roberts, opined that, quote, late in the fall and winter, British ships of war cannot encounter the tempestuous weather on our coast without almost inevitable destruction. What's he talking about? Later in the year, the hurricane season in the Northeast. Then there were the Doves, who felt essentially that rights and honor are not worth the bloodshed of war. Virginia's Congressman John Randolph was among them, as was Josiah Quincy, congressman from Massachusetts, and several editors of widely read newspapers. So the four options again: defend rights and honor through unlimited war, defend rights and honor through limited maritime war, delay armed conflict until prepared, and rights and honor just aren't worth bloodshed. No war. Don't be swayed by the history that you know. Employ what you've learned, study the options and support for them, and decide what you would have said in Congress on June 1st, 1812. Where will your decision take America? Are you a hawk? Are you a dove? Or are you a bystander? Have you carefully considered the causes and the consequences, the potential destruction of the economy? Are you prepared to send your sons, your husbands, your constituents in harm's way? John Randolph said, "I am an aristocrat. I believe in liberty, but not equality." Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death." A new nation is at a crossroads, and its fate, Congress, is in your hands. Now then, Wisteria, I hope you can hear me. Option 4, rights and honor are not worth bloodshed. I don't have the percentages for that.
Okay, it's 67% for option 2, defending rights and honor.
No, option 4.
Oh, there's none.
Okay. Well, we have one vote at least.
Nope.
I'll take it. I'll be the humanitarian. Then I'll also argue with me. A humanitarian voice. Yes. Just a few years ago, when you, sir, were not quite yet in breeches, the King's humanitarians came to our shores at Lexington, at Concord, in Boston, at Ticonderoga, and Yorktown to kill or wound 13,000 of our brothers and to keep us captive under their autocratic rule. No war, sir? Indeed. Let us return to virtual imprisonment on our own soil. Let the redcoats ride roughshod over our hard-won sovereignty. Our right freedom let us abandon, our fledgling democracy, and return to King George his rightful dictatorship. A novel solution, sir. Thank you. Option 3, Wisteria.
Option 3, there was 33%.
33%. Delay armed conflict until prepared. Wait till we're ready with our muskets. Ah, great vote. How do these names seem to you, sirs? Deptford, Portsmouth, Plymouth, Woolwich, Chatham, Sheerness. Let us build an armada navy while we recruit hardy and sea-tested sailors, sharpshooter marines, a regular army, and while we build a ship, Great Britain in the 6 royal dockyards I have just named, build 6 ships and impress those men I referred to, and they muster each and every day to train their conscripts in the art of warfare. Oh, we will get ready anon. The King's armies are ready, sir. Will be more so while we apprentice and teach our farmers, our merchants, and our shopkeepers to fire a pistol. Where is your mind? So much for option 3. Option 2.
67%.
Wow, 67%. Do I bore you? For I clearly see that you have not been listening. So in lieu of a sensible decision, you would parrot the strategy of Commodore Stephen Decatur. Stephen Decatur, a right well-learned naval officer. What else might he offer from his quarterdeck? A horse cavalry with muskets? His self-confidence in his 14 ocean-going ships of war with their green and inexperienced captains against King George's 130 plus battleships is admirable And I praise him for his inflated ego. Egos do not win battles, sir, especially when the odds are 10 to 1 against. Britannia rules the waves. Haven't you heard? Do we dare send our Davids against a flotilla of Goliaths? Can you swim, sir? How many voted for number 1, unlimited war?
None.
None. Of course, a newborn country of 7,700,000 against an established nation of 10,500,000. A navy of 14 ships against a navy of more than 130 ships. Our citizen soldiers, untrained, weakly led by officers who have mostly bought their commissions, poorly armed. It's difficult to imagine. So the great difference between regular experienced troops and an untried, inexperienced militia of farmers and merchants and shopkeepers. But try to understand, there is a difference. 450,000 called from their fields and shops to wage a war against an experienced standing army. Do we plan to win your war, sir, or simply exact revenge and such humiliation as we can toward King George before we surrender? It's a wonderful plan. Will you join that militia? What have we here? Truthfully, we have no good options. On the 18th of June in the year 1812, President James Madison signed the declaration of war against the British Empire. And 1 month later, the British began their invasion of the United States of America, taking Fort Mackinac in Michigan. The strength of the British Army proved too great for U.S. forces, both on land and at sea. U.S. troops suffered great losses. In August 1814, British troops entered Washington, D.C., burned the Capitol, burned the White House. By December, both the Americans and the British recognized that it was time to end the conflict. Representatives of the two nations met in Belgium and signed the Treaty of Ghent on December 24th, Christmas Eve in 1814, which ended the war and restored previously recognized boundaries between the United States and British territory in North America. The Senate unanimously ratified the Treaty of Ghent on February 16th, 1815. Roughly 15,000 Americans died as a result of the War of 1812. Roughly 8,600 British and Canadian soldiers lost their lives through war or disease. Who won the War of 1812? Now, if we have questions.
I do not have any questions in the chat box. Our guest, if you would like to type a question in the Q&A box. Oh, there's one. Let me get that. From Linda, she asks, why would Britain want to end the war?
They wanted to end the war because there was no cause to be had anymore. If we had to answer who won the war, probably the safest answer would be Canada. Britain could see no advance, had other wars elsewhere. Remember, she's still fighting Napoleon, did not see an advantage in fighting what was often called the Second American Revolution. Too little to gain, too much to lose. Good question. Thank you.
David says, good talk, very informative. Any other questions? Okay, Peter just joined at 1800 Greenwich Mean Time. Normally Eastern Standard Time +5 seems to be at the end of it. Have we changed to summertime? So I guess the answer to that is yes, we sprung up, what, 2 weeks ago? I have no other questions.
Okay,
Okay. Well,
Thank you very much.
everybody, for attending.